very much, Olga. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we will see more of you after at the reception. So we're looking forward to seeing more of your performance. Thank you, and to your colleagues. Thank you. We're going to... I have the great pleasure of being your moderator today for this very rich program that has been put together. And thank you so much for joining us in such large numbers. This is obviously an event that is of great interest to many people, and it's good to see such a range of people here. My name is Shauna Olney. I'm the Chief of the Gender Equality and Diversity Branch at the International Labour Organization. Almost exactly 10 years ago, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the General Assembly. And I think many of you in this room were very much part of making that happen. Along with ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, the international community now has two very strong instruments which have marked an irreversible turning point. And we're starting to see some very important changes. Anniversaries are a time of celebration. They're also a time when we look back and we reflect. Today we will look at how far we've come in making Indigenous people's rights a reality on the ground. And importantly, what we can do together to accelerate and sustain this progress. The 2030 Agenda is a historic opportunity to do this, and we must seize this opportunity. At the very outset, I'd like to thank the European Union for making this timely event possible. The ILO and the EU have a long-standing and extensive partnership to promote decent work and social justice, and we are proud that this includes working for the rights of Indigenous peoples and working with Indigenous peoples. Today's panel brings together a very diverse group of voices, but all are committed to the goal of promoting and ensuring the rights of Indigenous peoples. I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our distinguished keynote speakers for the first part of today's event. Minister Sven Mikser of Estonia, who's representing the current EU presidency. European Union Commissioner Neven Mimiska, who's responsible for international development. And we have, directly on my right, the Undersecretary of State, Elina Kaiku of Finland. Myrna Cunningham, to the right of the Minister, is the Chair of the Executive Council of the Fund for Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. And finally, on our first panel, we have Joanne Carling, who is the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for the SDGs. I think we'll start right away with Minister Miska. Your Excellency, in its role as holding the EU presidency, Estonia has strongly supported Indigenous people's rights. And building on earlier EU policies, the Council has very recently adopted conclusions in this regard. And we look forward to hearing about these new policies. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner Mimica. It's a huge pleasure for me to address this event that is jointly organized by the European Commission and my own country, Estonia, which is currently holding the rotating presidency of the European Union Council. An event that is dedicated to the rights of the Indigenous peoples. I would like to start by saying that the protection of the rights of Indigenous people is a vital part of Estonia's foreign policy and also human rights activities in all international organizations. We very firmly believe that Indigenous peoples add to the diversity of the world and enrich our cultures. Indeed, Estonians, together with Finns and Hungarians and all other small ethnic Indigenous Finno-Ugric people, possess a language and a culture and artistic tradition that are quite unique in both European and global terms, and we believe are irreplaceable part of our roots and heritage. It is paramount that the international community does everything possible to support indigenous peoples, honor their past and guarantee the future. The adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples 10 years ago was a crucial step towards the recognition, promotion and protection of the rights and freedoms of indigenous peoples. However, today the world's indigenous peoples still face vast challenges. In many countries, fundamental rights, including economic, social and cultural rights of the indigenous peoples, are not respected. This has led to their exclusion and the discrimination against them. We have also witnessed that the space for indigenous human rights defenders is shrinking in many places around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, as the foreign minister of a country that is currently holding the presidency of the European Union Council, I would like to use the opportunity to underline that the European Union has at various occasions reiterated its commitment towards the indigenous people. In May this year, the EU adopted Council conclusions on the indigenous peoples, and it has included the protection of the rights of the indigenous people among its priorities in UN Human Rights Forum. We emphasize the importance of addressing the discrimination and inequalities based on indigenous origin or identity. In particular, we are worried about the threats to and the violence against indigenous peoples in the context of land and natural resources. Estonia welcomes the adoption of the resolution by the General Assembly on the 8th of September. We will continue to engage in the consultations at the UN to enable the widest possible participation of indigenous peoples' representatives in meetings of all relevant UN bodies on issues that affect them. In this context, we highlight the role of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Estonia, as the consistent donor of the fund, invites the member states to allocate resources to assist the participation of indigenous peoples and the implementation of the United Nations Declaration of the Indigenous Peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, I am particularly happy to address this event together with the EU Commissioner for Development Cooperation, Neven Mimica, as today we launch the Indigenous Navigator, a very useful platform for the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. Estonia welcomes digital innovation for data gathering and believes the benefits of the technological progress. We believe that it must be fully exploited with regard to the protection of the indigenous people. This tool is necessary in order to monitor and assess the implementation of the Declaration of the Indigenous Peoples and the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. We believe it will further contribute to the preservation and promotion of indigenous languages. In this regard, we welcome that the year 2019 has been declared as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. In conclusion, I believe that we should make more effort to protect the rights of the indigenous peoples. Thus, we call all member states to fully implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international principles codifying the rights, including the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for ensuring the visibility and the centrality of the rights of indigenous peoples during the EU presidency of Estonia. And also the very clear support for the Indigenous Navigator, which we'll hear about in the second part of our program today. Thank you very much. Let me now introduce Commissioner Mimica, who is the Commissioner of the European Union and has been a key player as regards both the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Under your leadership, sir, the EU has recently achieved a new European consensus, and we thank you very much for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing about these very important developments. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Minister Mixer, dear Sven, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks to the Estonian government, to our co-sponsors, and to our eminent speakers for highlighting this important issue. I'm pleased to see that today's event has a good gender and geographical balance, in line with our beliefs. A special thanks also to Olga, whose performance is a celebration of diversity and embodies the true importance of giving voice to our many cultures, languages, and traditions. At 370 million, indigenous peoples are the third largest population globally, just ahead of the United States and behind China and India. But too often, their collective voice is not heard. They remain some of the most marginalized in our society, particularly women and girls, who suffer double discrimination on the basis of their gender and ethnicity. Europe is a union which celebrates diversity, and this has long guided our external actions too. For more than 20 years, we have guidelines and policies in place to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples through our development and environmental actions. The European Union is committed to respecting the free, prior and informed consent of the communities concerned by its activities, and to supporting the rights of indigenous peoples to self-development in their traditional areas. This includes their full and effective participation at all stages of our project implementation and integrating their concerns in our political dialogues with partner countries. Signed in June, our new European Consensus on Development reaffirmed our commitment to strengthening indigenous peoples' rights as both an end in itself and a means to increase the impact, inclusiveness, and sustainability of our development efforts. As you know, there has also been considerable progress in recent years to create a framework at the international level through the United Nations and the International Labour Organization. There is an increased recognition of the indigenous peoples as agents of change in delivering global sustainable development, human rights, and climate change commitments. Despite this progress, however, significant gaps remain between the recognition of rights on paper and their implementation on the ground. The European Union is committed to supporting our partners to put these principles into practice, in line with a rights-based approach. We have successfully supported measures in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to include the International Labour Organization's Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples' Rights into national policy and legislative frameworks. We also provide a technical secretariat which promotes the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives in United Nations bodies and meetings through training, translation, and information updates. And we have recently replicated this at a European level with a dedicated team in Brussels to ensure access to the European institutions. The Global Indigenous Navigator initiative that we are launching today seeks to increase indigenous people's access to justice through better monitoring and reporting of rights violations in a number of pilot countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. You don't need me to remind you that the underlying promise of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is to leave no one behind. And perhaps nowhere will our success or failure be felt more we face as a global community, the more we will need to call on our collective and diverse wisdom. None are perhaps more closely attuned to the challenges and opportunities of genuinely sustainable development than indigenous communities across the globe. So thank you once again for your participation here today. And I look forward to discussing how we can continue to engage and empower indigenous peoples in support of our overall efforts to eradicate poverty and inequality once and for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner, for those inspiring words and for your own leadership in this area, which we very much appreciate. And for reminding us that no one left behind is not just a mantra. It's not just something that we should all say, and we all say it very easily. We say it in every forum, but we have to understand what that means and really do something meaningful about it. You also reminded us, and I think it's very important, that there are groups that are being left behind within the groups that are being left behind. I think the reference to Indigenous women is extremely important. So we have to have policies and approaches that also look at the different groups within the overall population. So very much appreciate those reflections. I'm now going to turn to Elena Kalku, who is next to me, the Undersecretary of State, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Finland. Finland has been supporting Indigenous rights globally, but also taking very important and innovative steps at home. And we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the Estonian presidency of the European Union, the Commission, the ILO, and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for SDGs, and the partners for having convened this important meeting on a very, very important issue. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to address you, and I will cover a little bit of the SDG theme in particular, since that is one of the future projects that we all share together. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was an important milestone for the recognition and advancement of Indigenous peoples' rights. And we have all reason to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Declaration. But at the same time, we definitely have no room for complacency. Fulfilling the objectives of the UN Declaration requires constant work, both nationally and internationally. And the 2030 Agenda indeed brings a whole new dimension to this work. The nearly 400 million indigenous peoples worldwide are mentioned several times in the 2030 Agenda, and rightly so. Among the many rights and issues important to indigenous peoples are reflected indeed in the agenda, including the respect for human rights, human dignity, rule of law, equality and non-discrimination, respect for ethnicity and cultural diversity, and participatory decision-making. Indigenous peoples are mentioned with goals on eradicating of hunger and on education. And the Indigenous Peoples Major Group has made highly relevant recommendations regarding the SDGs. And the Navigator, of course, will be an important tool. But I think the whole philosophy behind the 2030 Agenda is compelling. Leave no one behind. All the goals are about everyone, and I think we have to keep this in mind as well. When all the goals are implemented around the world, the indigenous people must be part of it. Indigenous women and girls should not be left out, as was just pointed by the Commissioner. And when the follow-up is done at the UN on a global level, one of the most demanding tasks the UN actually has ever had, probably, the indigenous peoples are needed on board. Indigenous people's participation must be enhanced. This is something Finland works hard for. Their traditional knowledge and cultural approaches are of high relevance and value for achieving sustainable development. Indigenous people's meaningful participation, knowledge and practices are vital to ensure informed and viable decisions, both nationally and at the UN. And in Finland, we don't see this as a monopoly of the governments to say what sustainable development means to different actors. Genuine ownership and commitment can only be created by bottom-up participatory approach and with continuous dialogue and trust. It is important that the society as a whole is included in the process. The key mechanism to engage different actors in my own country has been our National Commission for Sustainable Development, and it is led by our Prime Minister. The Commission actually has continued to operate without interruption for 24 years, so it's actually older than the 2030 agenda itself. And it is a hybrid governance model combining high-level leadership with broad-based participation. There are altogether 50 members representing all spheres of the society, and this includes a representative from the Sami parliament. We also set up a societal commitment for sustainable development online, and anyone, be it a community, a municipality, company or NGO, can join with an online commitment. And in a fairly short time, we have collected more than 700 commitments on the SDGs. The UN Declaration's commitment of participation and respectful partnership must resonate the 2030 world. For the past years, member states and indigenous peoples have engaged on how to enhance indigenous peoples' representative institutions' participation at the UN in matters affecting them. For example, the Sami Parliament, the representative body of the Sami, the only indigenous people in Finland, is such a representative institution. And as these institutions are not NGOs, they have limited access to many UN meetings. This makes it very hard for them to have their voice heard independently at the UN. And as a result of consultations, the General Assembly took 8th of September a decision on continued UN deliberations in partnership with indigenous peoples. And this work must continue, and we have to find a solution here. Finland is committed to working with everyone to enhance and uphold the enriching voices of the indigenous peoples also in the years to come. We encourage member states and indigenous peoples to contribute to these discussions actively. Experience shows that deliberations at the UN have become richer and much more diverse with the participation of the indigenous peoples. Let's promote together real progress both at the General Assembly and other UN bodies addressing indigenous peoples' rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us that there is no room for complacency. If we want to make real change, real transformation, it's not just about doing the same things, but really changing our overall approach. And I think that's extremely important. You also talked about Indigenous peoples as really agents of change. They have to be involved. The idea of participation, of voice. We're not doing things for Indigenous people, we're doing things with them. And that they have to be there in the processes. And thank you for the active battle to make that happen in reality in the UN system as well. You also mentioned the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, and that's just a lovely segue into our next speaker, so thank you for that. Joanne Carling has been a driving force behind Indigenous peoples' efforts to engage in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals and is the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for the SDGs. And of course is an Indigenous global leader who many of us know and have worked with for many, many years. Thank you for telling us about some of the opportunities and challenges in the context of the SDG framework that you see. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Shona, and good morning to everyone. Indigenous peoples are often portrayed as backwards or obstacles to development. On the contrary, Indigenous peoples possess the knowledge, skills, wisdom, and experience in nurturing the only planet that we all share. The lands, territories and resources managed by Indigenous peoples are better conserved and remain rich in biodiversity. This is because our natural environment makes us who we are. It is the source of our identity, our culture, spirituality, and ways of life. The practice of Indigenous peoples of nurturing the environment for the future generations exemplifies our vision of sustainability. Likewise, our values and practices of cooperation, solidarity, reciprocity, upholding the common good, and collective decision-making are essential for our collective survival and development. Our histories of colonization, subjugation, in the process of state building and modern national development has resulted in systemic discrimination, marginalization, and genocide of Indigenous peoples. Our sustainable societies were devastated alongside exploitation and expropriation of our lands and resources, and adversely affecting our Indigenous institutions, cultures, and well-being. Many Indigenous peoples are among the most exploited and marginalized in the labor market, and Indigenous women suffer multiple layers of violence and exploitation because of their poverty, gender, and ethnicity. Indigenous peoples have struggled and lobbied for the recognition of our collective rights by the UN system as a matter of our collective survival. This has joyfully resulted in the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples after 20 years of negotiation. As we now embark on the global agenda for sustainable development with the pledge of leaving no one behind, we need to seriously reflect on the models of sustainable development that is transformative, inclusive, and just. The world needs Indigenous peoples to reverse the business-as-usual approach based on massive resource extraction, economic domination, and control of resources and technologies by the few and the powerful. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development upholds the principles of equality, non-discrimination, accountability, participation, and the realization of human rights. From the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples secures our inclusion and provides the enabling environment for us to pursue our sustainable models of development. While we have serious concerns on the implementation gaps of the UN Declaration and our meaningful participation and inclusion in the SDG processes, we are very much encouraged by the commitment and support and actions of the European Union and other actors for the promotion of Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being. We fully appreciate this event taking place on the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on the occasion of the UN General Assembly. We welcome partnerships with states and development actors that will further enhance our mutual contributions to sustainable development, such as on sustainable resource management, enhancement of cultural diversity and biodiversity, food security, and empowerment of women, among others, uplifting Indigenous peoples as actors and agents of change and not as helpless victims. I enjoin everyone in the room to work with Indigenous peoples in achieving sustainable development for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for your own personal commitment and passion and your tireless leadership that we've seen throughout the years. You remind us of the interlinkages of all the SDGs, and I think that's something really important to remember. that all of them are relevant to Indigenous peoples, and we have to see how they fit together. You also talked about the importance of a range of actors and the fact that we all, each one of us in this room and beyond, have a role to play. So thank you so much for those words. Our final speaker in this session, this section of the program, will be Myrna Cunningham. I don't think Myrna actually needs any introduction. You have been an Indigenous representative from Nicaragua for many years and a global leader. You now have a new and particularly visible and influential role in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we congratulate you very much on your appointment. Thank you so much for sharing with us your assessments and vision on this 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration. The floor is yours, Myrna.
Thank you very much. Titanyamni, I greet you in the language of my people, the Miskito Indigenous Nation in Nicaragua, that next month will be celebrating our 30th anniversary of regional autonomy, legislation that was approved as part of a peace process 30 years ago that recognizes Indigenous collective and individual rights. I also thank you for inviting the Fondo para el Desarrollo de Pueblos Indígenas de América Latina y el Caribe, that was created 25 years ago by the head of states of the Ibero-American countries, a fund that has the mandate to support self-determined development of indigenous peoples, a unique fund that is governed jointly by indigenous peoples and member states of the fund. Excellencies, brothers and sisters, my participation in this event today is a homage to our ancestors, men and women who believe that a good strategy for the restitutions of indigenous people's rights was to come to the global world and link our local resistance struggles with the international advocacy. The adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples 10 years ago expressed a global commitment to the rights of indigenous peoples that live in more than 90 countries in different parts of the world. Much has changed in the last 10 years. At the country level, we have seen a lot of changes in constitutions, in legislation, the institutions that really conduct indigenous issues. We have even seen changes at the subnational level in our countries. At the regional level, we have been able to see how the UN Declaration has been used in important jurisprudence to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. At the global level, we have also seen changes and the establishment of important institutions at the UN level to monitor the implementation of the declaration. We have also seen changes in the UN agencies. The adoption of the system-wide action plan for the implementation of the declaration has been an important step. But I think the most important change that we have been able to see in the last 10 years is the stronger movement of indigenous peoples. We are participating as indigenous peoples in framing the agenda on climate change, on food security, on women's rights, on youth participation. So we are in different areas advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples. We know that there are a lot of challenges that remain. But for me, the most important challenge is related with the implementation of the development agenda. Because development and the vision of development of indigenous peoples do not coincide with the current vision of development that is being promoted in most of our countries. We have repeatedly expressed our messages that what we understand as development has to do with traditional knowledge, has to do with indigenous participation, it has to do with a concept of well-being in which there's a balance between nature and human beings. Our vision of development has to do with the human rights-based framework. We see the Agenda 2030 as the opportunity to really bring these two global coincidences together. The coincidence on the declaration and the coincidence of leaving no one behind. How can you support this? And I see at least 2 or 3 ways in which you can help us. The first is, of course, supporting the Indigenous Peoples Major Group work. We have been able to be organized in the different regions, and we do need to increase the capacity of indigenous participation at country level and at the regional level. We are participating, but we really need to link what we are doing at the global level with what we are doing at the country and the regional level. The other way in which you can participate is supporting institutions like the Fondo Indigena. The Fondo Indigena, as I mentioned, has the governance of we have the opportunity because it's a platform of dialogue and consultation between member states and indigenous peoples. We have 19 member states that are members of the Fondo Indigena from Latin America and the Caribbean, and 3 extra regional partners, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium. And we need to use this platform of consultation. We are also involved in different activities that are related with development, with identity for indigenous peoples, and education with equity. At country level, we really need to continue the political dialogue. For example, in El Salvador and in Paraguay, we have been working together with the UN agencies and the governments and indigenous peoples to prepare the first national action plans to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we would like to see more of this happening. So I just would take the opportunity to invite all of the representatives of member states to join hands with indigenous peoples, and let's continue supporting these global commitments. If we really advance, we can really build a world in which there is reconciliation, in which we can really exercise our rights. The explicit support of the European Union, of Estonia, of the ILO that have organized this event is one of the good practices that we should continue at all levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miona. And again, you remind us that it's important to keep the link between the global and the local. We can't just focus on one at the expense of the other. And you also gave us very practical ways of doing that. So thank you so much for that intervention. Now, before we move on to the second part of our program, which will be really looking at the Indigenous Navigator, we are going to have interventions from representatives of Spain, Chile, and Canada. First, I'd like to invite Fernando Garcia Casas, Secretary of State of International Relations, Spain, to make a short intervention. And just before we do that, if I could just ask you to thank again the Commissioner, Mimiska, who will have to leave us for another event. Thank you, Commissioner, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Commissioner, for staying with us. I will be very brief. I will say that I'm our friends because I was firstly ambassador of Spain to Estonia, so Mr. Mixer was my minister over there, and we were in touch. And also Mirna coming in as a friend. We celebrated, she mentioned very appropriately, the 25th anniversary of the Fondo Indígena that we shared. I think it was a moving ceremony some 2 months ago in Madrid, because given that the long story of relation with the Latin American continent, we believe that this Fondo Indígena, established in 1992 in the first Ibero-American Summit, has the property of, as you very rightfully mentioned, of being equal. They are the member states and they are the indigenous communities. And it's working, its headquarters are in La Paz, and it's working beautifully. And it's true that in addition, from the European side of Portugal, Spain, and Belgium, some other members would be very, very welcome to join in. I believe it's good practice. And we also took advantage of this to give the master's degrees of a degree on indigenous people at the University Carlos III of Madrid, with people from many different communities joining, and it was a nice celebration. And also, as a third part of it, we renovated the prize Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas was one of the main defenders of the indigenous people's rights during the Spanish conquest, and every year the king and queen deliver the prize to leaders of these indigenous communities. So this is on the, let's say, Ibero-American framework, but it's also the same we are trying to do in the universal framework. We are cooperating with the UN, I want to belong, and since 2007 we have as a specific strategy for our international development cooperation with the indigenous peoples. And we will continue to do this, and we will continue financing the voluntary fund as we did. But maybe the main conclusion, because I want to be very short, is that whenever Agenda 2030 said not to leave anybody behind, I would say that because of my long-standing relation with the Fondo Indígena, that many things that you are doing is way ahead, is not leaving us behind. Is that many things regarding climate change, the sustainability of nature, food security is way ahead. So somehow what we have is to join you more than anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I'd like to pass the floor to Minister Marcos Barata, who is on my left, the Minister of Social Development of Chile. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
Hola, buenas tardes ya a todos y a todas. Quiero agradecer primero a la Unión Europea, a Estonia, a la Organización Internacional del Trabajo por esta posibilidad de intercambiar.
Okay, I'm going to be the interpreter. I'm not expert, but I'm going to try my best to translate and interpreter my minister. He's very thankful for the invitation, and he thanks the co-organizers, especially to Estonia and the member of the European Union to be here.
La idea central que quiero transmitir es que ciertamente como gobierno de Chile, como gobierno de la presidenta Bachelet, estamos plenamente comprometidos con la Agenda 2030.
The principal idea that I want to transmit to everyone is that my president, Ms. Bachelet, is fully compromised with the implementation of the Agenda 2030.
Pero es justo y es honesto decir que en materia de derechos económicos, sociales, culturales y políticos de pueblos indígenas,
it's important to say that it's right to say that the rights of indigenous persons.
Tenemos un déficit que es anterior a la Agenda 2030.
We have a deficit. We have to say the truth. We have some things behind that are left behind of the Agenda 2030 and his implementation.
Tras el retorno a la democracia en el año 90,
after the return to democracy, after the 90s in our country,
Chile ha impulsado sistemáticamente políticas públicas que aborden las desventajas de origen de los pueblos indígenas.
Chile has promoted many policies to recognize the rights of indigenous persons since that time.
Con efectividad en la disminución de la pobreza y de desigualdades.
They have been effective in some areas, like the improvement of people that are suffering poverty, and especially the respect of their rights as well.
Pero con una débil institucionalidad que establezca reconocimiento constitucional, político, cultural y de deliberación de los pueblos indígenas.
However, this implementation has been weak at the constitutional level. We need more laws to improve the implementation of the take care of this issue.
Junto con la participación activa de la sociedad para la construcción de una nueva constitución para Chile,
In this regard, we have extended this dialogue with the communities. We have been working with communities to change our constitution.
se ha establecido un proceso especial, pero no excluyente, para los pueblos indígenas.
We have been established a regard. They have rights, constitutional rights, before the constitution itself,
Consagrados constitucionalmente.
and those are basically in the constitution because they're previous.
Implica también la existencia de territorios especiales en la administración indígena.
It also includes specific lands that are going to be administrated for these communities.
Implica algo que es muy sustantivo, que es el reconocimiento del derecho colectivo, algo que nuestra Constitución hoy día no contempla.
And it also includes something very important, and at this point it doesn't exist in the Constitution. It's like the collective recognition. That
El segundo componente o núcleo importante es el establecimiento de escaños reservados en el Parlamento.
The second part is that this proposal includes some seats at the Parliament for representation.
Sin perjuicio de la existencia de consejos autónomos para cada uno de los 9 pueblos indígenas.
Okay, without forgetting the autonomy of those indigenous councils that are going to exist in every community.
9 pueblos.
In the 9
reconocidos por ley.
and the 9 communities recognized by the Constitution.
Este es el cambio institucional y de consagración constitucional que nunca antes en la historia de Chile habían experimentado los pueblos indígenas.
This is a real institutional change for the country and for the communities of Chile.
Nos encontramos en el proceso de consulta
We are in the consultation process,
y ya en el proceso participativo.
and also the communities are participating in this process.
Participaron 17.000 representantes de comunidades y organizaciones indígenas.
17,000 members of the communities have been working on this negotiation process.
Quiero concluir con cuál es el propósito político de fondo.
I would like to conclude telling you the political motive of this proposal.
Que la Constitución y las leyes que de ella derivan
That the Constitution and all the laws that are coming from the Constitution
consagren una participación política efectiva que les permita deliberar directamente a los pueblos
will establish a inclusive participation of the indigenous persons,
tanto en el ámbito legislativo como en los gobiernos regionales
As
y
well.
alcaldías,
in the Congress participation, municipalities, and the regional level
pero del mismo modo
as well.
una institucionalidad autónoma
At the same time, autonomy
que impida la cooptación o asimilación
that
al Estado.
avoids the assimilation of these communities to the state.
Lo hacemos con la convicción
We strongly believe
de que es un diálogo
that this dialogue
co-construido con los pueblos y el Estado,
has been constructed between the government and the indigenous people
de carácter incremental en términos de las medidas que se van adoptando,
in order to increase the implementation of these measures.
pero bajo la convicción
But with this conviction,
de que como país y Estado
considering that we are a country and a state,
tenemos una deuda histórica
we have a historical debt,
y que buscamos en parte comenzar a saldar,
and we are starting to pay back this debt with the communities, and I think this is just the beginning.
con la conformación de una república
with the constitution of a republic
realmente inclusiva.
that is really inclusive.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Our final intervention for this part of the program will be from my compatriot, Mr. Michael Gort, who is the Director of Global Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Canada. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, everybody. And I also would, turned off. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I want to start also by thanking the hosts of our meeting today, Estonia, the European Union, the ILO, of course, and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for SDGs. We're really happy to be here. And as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the signing of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we're reminded that it is a call to action for all governments around the world. And we're also reminded that there are still many steps to take to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. We know that there is a mutually reinforcing relationship between human rights and development. And we know that the 2013 Agenda for Sustainable Development will never be achieved without the realization of Indigenous peoples' rights across the globe. Canada believes that all UN member states must seek innovative ways and means to overcome challenges so that Indigenous peoples are enabled and empowered to enjoy their human rights and to benefit from the 2030 Agenda. In Canada, we are committed to advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples through a renewed nation-to-nation relationship that is based on recognition, rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. Among other collaborative initiatives and actions, Canada is implementing the Declaration through the review of domestic laws and policies, a process that is guided by the principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples that were released in July of this year. The first of these principles is the recognition of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. In Canada, schools are now beginning to teach that we must honor the treaties and agreements signed by Indigenous peoples and settlers. And where they don't exist, we are committed to finding new ways to recognize Indigenous rights and jurisdiction. Canada is also committed to advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples globally. We believe strongly that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate and to be heard in decisions that affect them at the UN. Participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant meetings is vital. The contributions of Indigenous peoples inform and enrich our discussions. Leaving no one behind means renewing our relationship with Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers and for the interventions, and again for the strong commitment that is coming from all the different actors in this area. We are now going to move to the second part of our program, which is the launch of the Indigenous Navigator. You'll see there's some documents over on the table there for those of you who haven't got them on your way out to be able to get there's a brochure and some information on the Navigator itself. It's at the same time a partnership, an innovative framework, and a tool for monitoring Indigenous peoples' rights from the perspective of Indigenous peoples themselves. And we've heard a lot about that this morning, that really this isn't about others imposing, but really it's about Indigenous peoples being actors of change. We will hear from the partners that are directly involved in the collaborative partnership that is at the same time global and local, which again we've heard about in our discussion this morning, how important that is to bring those two levels together. Afterwards, we should have time for contributions from others in the room. So please, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to make, we should be having time for that. The Indigenous Navigator brings together a group of diverse partners: the European Union, the ILO, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, the Danish Institute of Human Rights, the Forest Peoples Program, IFGIA, and the Tepteva Foundation. So again, quite a diverse group that are coming together to make this a reality. Our first speaker is Birgitta Fielding, and we refer to Birgitta as the mother of the Indigenous Navigator. It was really her who gave birth to it in terms of the idea and setting up the framework. So Birgitta, we turn to you for Indigenous Navigator in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you, Shona, and thank you for not referring to me as the grandmother of the Indigenous Navigator. I have to apologize already that I will be a bit technical because I'm going to give you an overview of this framework, and then other colleagues will follow up and speak more about the experiences from the ground. But I just want to say that the Indigenous Navigator is an innovative tool for measuring, monitoring Indigenous people's rights and development. And since the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples 10 years ago, this was really a dream for those of us working on these issues to have tools that would allow us to actually follow and measure progress of its implementation. So it is that dream that is coming through also with the help of the European Union. So we thank you very much for that, for having the trust to invest in something that we didn't know exactly how it would look like and how it would end when we embarked on this. I'm going to refer to the concepts and elements that you can see on the screen behind Shona, because the Indigenous Navigator is a very comprehensive but also a coherent framework for monitoring. All the elements of this framework fit together, but all the elements are also tools by themselves and can be used independently, not only by Indigenous peoples, but by all actors concerned with promoting and adhering to the rights of Indigenous peoples, be they government institutions, NGOs, companies, etc. It's quite also a, I should say, a technical and complicated framework perhaps, but we tried to make it very simple and very user-friendly in its presentation. So it's like the mobile phone that we're all using. We don't really know what's inside it, but we know that it works for us. So this is how we want the Indigenous Navigator to appear for users. Some of the key elements, just very briefly. The starting point is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that cover the full range of Indigenous peoples' rights. So we started with a profound analysis of this declaration, identifying the thematic domains of this instrument, land, territories and resources, governance, education, etc. And then we organized it thematically, but also did a profound analysis of how the elements of the UN Declaration relate back to universal human rights. So we are also reinforcing the fact that the UN Declaration does not introduce new rights or special rights for Indigenous peoples. It articulates and contextualizes universal human rights as they apply to Indigenous peoples. So that's one of the separate tools that came out of the Indigenous Navigator process, that we now have a matrix that shows exactly how universal human rights, ILO Convention 169 and other instruments, relate back to the provisions of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Likewise, we make the linkages, the connections to the SDGs that were kind of emerging when we started talking about the Indigenous Navigator. Concretely, we now know that approximately 1/3 of the targets of the SDGs relate directly to specific provisions of the UN grid. So I just want to reaffirm what Michael Gord said a moment ago, that there can be no sustainable development without realization of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Then in 2014 came the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. States made commitments. They came up with commitments that constitute a roadmap for achieving the SDGs. And we also analyzed how does these commitments relate back to specific provisions of the UN Declaration. So through this comprehensive analysis, we came up with attributes, the building blocks that look at these commitments together. And based on these attributes, we look for the best possible indicators to measure whether these commitments are implemented or not. That was a process in itself. We looked at data availability because we knew that we needed to operationalize these indicators. We needed to find indicators that would allow us to actually measure. So we have produced a full set of indicators that measure all these key attributes of sustainable development and the UN Declaration. And based on that, we develop questionnaires that people can answer, hopefully in a very simple way. Questionnaires that on the one hand, capture indigenous people's own experience, whether their rights are realized or not. On the other hand, are good for national profiling. And all of this results in data. Data that can be used for so many different purposes that we will hear more about later. We have also elaborated a way of calculating indexes, so we can actually look at index values, compare data across countries and communities and over time. And as was said before, there are more materials at the back of the room if you want to dive into the technicalities of this. But let me just conclude with showing you a few slides about what is the kind of data that the Indigenous Navigator can produce. I don't know if you can see it, but this is actually, trying to profile the situation in a particular country. This is the Philippines. Capture, the red line shows how laws and policies are reflecting indigenous people's rights on the different thematic domains. So in terms of health, in terms of governance, to what extent are indigenous people's rights reflected in laws and policies. And on the other hand, the blue line is how the realization of rights are experienced by a particular community, the Kankanay community of the Philippines. So just a few highlights. The Philippines have laws on consultation and consent, but at the community level, they don't feel that these laws are really implemented. On the other hand, the Philippines don't really have laws that protect indigenous languages, but in the community they're still maintaining very vibrant their language. So it also speaks about the resilience of indigenous communities, and of course it's also a way of visualizing the implementation gap between laws and actual experiences. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, you see here 3 Baka children from Cameroon. Forest People's Program, the partner of the Indigenous Navigator, has conducted, has collected data in Baka communities, and the data shows that 98% of all Baka men and women are poor. And when they talk about poverty, it's not that they cannot afford to have the newest iPhone or go on a holiday. We're talking about hunger, malnutrition, poor health, illiteracy, etc. So just a simple data that are coming out of the community survey in Cameroon. And finally, we did a profiling of 14 countries. I'm not going to mention any names here, but within this sample, these countries, they all committed at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples to come up with a plan, a national action plan or other measures to implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And within our sample, the figure is that 0% of these countries had developed such a plan. So I'm just showing this because what is the aim of data? What is the purpose of data? It's definitely not to collect data. The world is full of data. We need data that can drive the change that we need towards realization of sustainable development and indigenous people's rights. And our hope is that the Indigenous Navigator data can drive exactly that process of change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky-san. I think the only advantage of starting at 0 is that the only way we can go is up. So I think there's definitely progress to be made, and hopefully we'll move that. But thank you for for explaining to us how the Indigenous Navigator works and just the importance of getting that data for change. We'll now move on to Stanley Kimavin. He's the Executive Director of the Indigenous Livelihoods Enhancement Partners. And we look forward to hearing about your experiences and your reflections related to the role of the Indigenous Navigator for local communities. Mr. Kimavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, the EU family, ILO, and the Indigenous People Media Group for bringing all of us together to talk and exchange views on this very important matter of Indigenous people's rights. It is difficult coming almost last not to repeat a few things said before, because the first session of this talk sets sort of the background for the Indigenous People Navigator. And my reflections are around what I'm calling three disconnected realities and a possible way to put them. And I think what is informing these realities, one of them is that we have had a very flawed historical development pathways that has privileged certain knowledge systems, certain cultures, certain needs over others, and ultimately extinguishing other rights and making it impossible in producing the sorry state of Indigenous people. So one of these realities, which has been eloquently highlighted by most, is an increasing positive arena for Indigenous people's rights. So the UN Human Rights System, the Climate Change Convention system, the SDGs, multilateral processes and organizations, the EU itself, and Kenya, where I come from, has also now a number of legislation speaking to the Indigenous people issue. But the second reality, disconnected from the first, is a business as usual scenario. Even though this landscape has changed, violation of Indigenous people's rights continues. As we speak, pastoral communities in Laikipia in Kenya have had their livestock shot and their homes burned down. In Loliondo in Tanzania, pastoral Maasai communities have been evicted from their ancestral land with no compensation. And the list continues. In Arusha, we have had exclusion of communities from their lands based on geothermal power generation in the name of clean energy. And we have also seen another reality is that of non-disaggregated data related to the situation of development with respect to Indigenous people. The outcome of this non-disaggregated data that reflects the situation of Indigenous people is such that it ignores and dissolves and negates the unique rights provided for Indigenous peoples in this global system and national spaces. The outcome also, these outcome processes which you've mentioned as gains do not speak to each other. They are isolated, they stand alone, yet they speak about one constituency, Indigenous peoples. And the ultimate effect of this business as usual scenario is that it makes the slogan, leaving no one behind, hollow, devoid of transformative value that brings those who are left behind into the core of discussions and benefiting from the fruits of development. The third sort of reality is what Joanne talked about, the reality of Indigenous people conserving and being good custodians of nature, contributing least, for example, to global emissions, sustaining this landscape, and finding innovative ways, creative ways to adapt and mitigate to climate change on the ground and monitoring daily their livelihood system. And so in terms of breaching this disconnect, the Indigenous Navigator is one of the tools that provides an opportunity to try and bring in some way. In Kenya and the community where I come from, we piloted the Indigenous Navigator among pastoral community in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. And one of the realities that we saw in implementing this is that the existing frameworks for reporting are distant from Indigenous people, both spatially and perceptually. Second, the existing monitoring frameworks the life cycle, like 5 years, like the Universal Periodic Review for Human Rights, is saying maybe after 4 years, and it comes after the fact, is disconnected from the daily dynamics and realities of indigenous peoples on the ground. The Indigenous Navigator, therefore, appears to be one of the greatest efforts to establish a framework and tool to translate textual gains into meaningful respect of human rights for indigenous people. The Indigenous Navigator provides a landscape approach to monitoring human rights related instruments, thereby giving a big picture scenario of rights as opposed to the fragmented constituency, single instrument based or centric approaches where you monitor gender, you monitor children's rights, but the Navigator provides a nexus where all these rights can be monitored and action taken. It turned out to be a very powerful tool for awareness creation for indigenous peoples in our community. As they interact with the tools and the questionnaires, the reality dawns on them that actually they are not aware that these rights exist or this exists in law, and therefore they need to build these capacities. It also came out that monitoring human rights, and I think it has been said earlier by the EU Commissioner for International Affairs and Development, that it's a risky affair. The people who monitor and report these human rights are putting their lives on danger, and many a times they pay the price for their own lives to be able to monitor these rights. So the question as we move ahead is, how do we then institutionalize, build the infrastructure, and localize the Indigenous Navigator in a sustainable way beyond project lifespan? This is a project, a 3-5 year project. What happens after the project? Can communities pick up the tool and run with it? How do we link the outcomes of the Indigenous Navigator reports to monitoring existing monitoring framework across levels? And I think I should stop there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. You've left us with some thoughts that I think we're all going to have to ponder on, and in a discussion afterwards, I think some of those issues we need to come back to in terms of the sustainability of the navigator, how do you link it to existing monitoring frameworks. But you have a quote here that I'm sure we're going to tweet any minute now. The Indigenous Navigator is one of the greatest instruments to translate textual gains into meaningful respect for human rights. I think that was a really, really powerful statement. And we really want the Indigenous Navigator to live up to that aspiration that you set. So thank you very much. Our last speaker in this section is Kala Chakama, who is leading the, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so please correct me if I get it wrong, the Kapain Foundation in Bangladesh, which is one of the main organizations of indigenous peoples in that country. He has been very much involved in the community engagement around the SDGs, and will tell us about his experience with and his hopes for the Indigenous Navigator in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you. It is considered that Bangladesh was one of the successful countries in implementing the MDGs. However, indigenous people were invisible in the implementation of the MDGs. That's why their situation has not changed even after the period of the MDGs. So now we are in the period of SDGs. That's why we, indigenous people, hope that indigenous people would be visible in the implementation process of SDGs in Bangladesh. Why indigenous people were invisible and why their situation has not changed is also reflected in the Bangladesh government's 7 5-year plan. And in that document, it is mentioned that, quote, the ethnic communities in Bangladesh are the most deprived of economic, social, cultural, and political rights, mainly due to their ethnic status. ethnic identities are creating barriers to ethnic minority people's inclusion in wider social networks, unquote. The lack of proper recognition in the national constitution, non-recognition of the traditional and customary land rights, denial of access to justice, lack of proper representation in the decision-making, etc. are also some of the problems faced by those communities. The government has been taking some positive steps for the betterment of indigenous people and recognize their rights through different plans and policy statements, including the education policy, the tribal health, nutrition and population plan, as for ethnic groups, cultural institution Act 2010, amendment of Chittagong Hill Tracts Land Dispute Resolution Commission Act of 2001, etc. It also took steps to introduce mother tongue-based education in 5 indigenous languages. However, proper implementation of those policies and plans are still a big challenge. The Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord, which was signed in 1997, is considered one of the constructive measures taken by the government to establish peace and harmony in Chittagong Hill Tracts. However, even after 20 years of the signing of the accord, major provisions of the accord are still unimplemented. Thus, conflict and human rights violations remain a problem for indigenous peoples in Chittagong Hill Tracts. Indigenous women continue to suffer from different forms of violence and discrimination. In 2016, there were 53 documented cases of violence against indigenous women, in which 58 women and girls were assaulted sexually and physically. Indigenous peoples organizations in Bangladesh have been engaging with government bodies, human rights organizations, and development actors in raising our concern and aspirations. We will be undertaking a major systematic monitoring of our rights using the Indigenous Navigator, and this was already described by my previous speakers. With this, we hope to raise for attention and action to the rights and development issues of indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, including women, indigenous women. In the existing 5-year plan of the government, it expressed its strong commitment to consider implementing UN-DRIP and ratifying ILO Convention number 169 on indigenous and tribal people. Almost the same promise was made in the first 2 5-year plans, but unfortunately, no significant changes have been noticed on the ground. We want to believe that this time the government will come forward to make good on its promise. Finally, I would like to point out here that now Bangladesh government is on its way to develop the National Action Plan for implementation of the SDGs. Until now, the indigenous peoples are yet to be consulted and have meaningful participation in process, which is a key element of the UNG. Also, the spirit of the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 is to leave no one behind. It is thereby important that the indigenous peoples of the country are engaged in the SDGs, that their voices are heard, their rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled in the spirit of the UNG. I thank you all.
Thank you so much. I think you really connected the dots so well there between the Indigenous Navigator, the SDGs, the UN Declaration, ILO Convention 169. Very nice way to wrap all that together. I had promised you that we would have time for a discussion and questions. We have unfortunately run out of time. However, it's not dire, because we do have a reception following with a cultural performance, and we will have time there where you can talk to different panelists, where you can discuss, and where we continue, I think, what has been an extraordinarily rich discussion and conversation this morning. I'd just like to ask each of our panelists in 10 seconds, what is your takeaway that you want people to remember moving forward today? We'll start with Kim Evan. You have 10 seconds.
I thought I'd be last, just like I was. Well, I think for me, the main challenge now facing global indigenous peoples is less the recognition of right and more the implementation of the aids in text. And so the challenge for me remains really how to move away from a beautiful sounding slogan of leaving no one behind to a practical action-oriented implementation of the UN. And I thank you.
Excellent. Very, very concise. Farah.
In the MDGs, we were invisible, but this time we want to be included in the all-level implementation process of SDGs, so we don't want to be left behind. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
We need concerted efforts to achieve that implementation on the ground. We need multiple actors. We work with the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, and we do think that national human rights institutions can help provide a bridge between governments, civil society, companies, indigenous communities, etc.
Thank you so much. Joanne.
Yeah, that indigenous peoples are active partners and actors in achieving sustainable development for all and the realization of human rights.
Thank you. Mirna, last 10 seconds.
We can build dialogue platforms between indigenous peoples and governments to define public policies that are
Absolutely. That's huge. Would you like to say a quick word?
Thank you, Shanna. I think the wisdom is there, so I don't need to add a lot, and I think we are very supportive that we do whatever we can to go to the
Thank you so much. And Minister Miska had to leave, and he sends his regrets, but thanks us to thank you for the time today together and for all the thoughts. Elena, we end with you.
I fully agree with Stanley. This is about implementation, and implementation. And we have to make use of all the fantastic tools that we now have to know more where we are and then move forward from there.
Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking all our panelists and all our... You're all welcome to join us at the reception and cultural performance across the street of the Millennium Hilton, New York, 1 UN Plaza. We have people that will escort you over if you would like, otherwise you're welcome to make your way there. It's on the 28th floor in the room Landmark. And we again would like to thank the European Commission and the Estonian Presidency for today's event and for the reception.